It was a quiet afternoon in the small town of Millhaven. The sun was shining, and a cool breeze moved through the trees. Birds chirped in the distance, and children laughed as they played in the park. People walked along the sidewalks, chatting and enjoying the lovely weather. Among them was Clara, holding onto the harness of her guide dog, Shadow. She walked carefully, her steps steady and sure. Shadow, a strong and loyal dog, guided her down the familiar streets. To most people, Clara looked like just another blind woman trying to go about her day. Some glanced at her with sympathy, while others simply walked past without noticing her at all. But what they didn't know was that Clara and Shadow had a very special bond, one that was far more than just a guide dog and his owner. Shadow wasn't just any dog. He was smart, brave, and had a past that no one could have guessed by just looking at him. Clara was used to the whispers and stares. She could feel people watching her sometimes, wondering how she managed to move around so confidently. What they didn't understand was that Clara didn't let her blindness stop her. She had learned to trust Shadow with all her heart. And in return, Shadow never let her down. As they walked, Clara smiled softly. She loved Millhaven. It was a small town where she had lived all her life. She knew every street, every turn, and every little shop by heart. The smell of fresh bread from the bakery filled the air, and she could hear the sound of bicycles rolling by. Everything felt familiar and safe. But what Clara didn't know was that today would not be like every other day. Today, something unexpected was about to happen. Shadow walked beside her, his ears alert and his body tense, always watching and listening. Clara couldn't see the world around her, but she could feel things in her own way. She knew Shadow was more than just a guide. He was her protector, her friend, and her eyes in a world she could not see. "Good boy, Shadow," Clara said softly, patting his head as they walked past a row of parked cars. The dog wagged his tail happily, proud to be by her side. He loved Clara just as much as she loved him. He had been with her for years, helping her cross streets, avoid obstacles, and even sense when something wasn't right. He was always there, watching over her. As they reached the corner, Clara heard the distant sound of motorcycles. The loud roar of engines made her grip Shadow's harness a little tighter. She never liked the noise, it was too sudden and too loud. Shadow stopped for a moment, his body stiffening. Clara could tell he was paying close attention to something. "Is something wrong, Shadow?" she asked quietly. Shadow didn't bark or move, but Clara could feel his muscles tense under her hand. She trusted him completely. If Shadow was being careful, then she needed to be careful too. As they continued walking, the sound of motorcycles grew louder. Clara could hear a group of people talking and laughing. They sounded rough, loud, and a little rude. She took a deep breath and kept walking, trusting Shadow to lead her safely through the busy street. A few people standing nearby whispered as she passed. "Look at her," someone said. "Poor thing. She's so brave." Clara ignored them. She was used to hearing comments like that. Some people felt sorry for her because she couldn't see, but Clara didn't want pity. She had learned to live her life just like anyone else. Just as they crossed the street, a deep voice called out. "Hey, lady! Watch where you're going!" Clara stopped in her tracks. She didn't know who was talking, but she could tell they were speaking to her. Shadow stood still, his ears perked up in alert. "Is that a guide dog?" another voice asked, followed by laughter. "Looks like a lazy mutt to me." Clara felt her face grow warm, but she stayed calm. She had heard worse things before. People could be unkind sometimes, but she had learned to ignore them. She gave Shadow a small tug and continued walking, keeping her head up. But the voices didn't stop. "Hey, you think that dog's tough?" one of the men said. "I bet he wouldn't last a second against my Rottweiler." More laughter followed, and Clara could hear footsteps coming closer. Shadow growled low in his throat, a warning to stay away. "Easy, Shadow," Clara whispered, trying to stay calm. She didn't want any trouble, but she knew Shadow wouldn't let anyone hurt her. Clara could feel the men watching her, but she didn't let it bother her. She had faced challenges her whole life, and today was no different. She trusted Shadow, and that was all she needed. What the bikers didn't know was that Shadow wasn't just an ordinary guide dog. He had once been a trained police canine, working with officers to catch dangerous criminals. He had chased down thieves, sniffed out hidden drugs, and even helped save lives. After retiring, he was placed with Clara, and since then, he had been her constant companion and protector. Shadow might have looked like just a regular dog, but inside, he was still a hero. As they walked past the group, Shadow stayed close to Clara's side, his eyes locked on the men. He didn't trust them, and Clara could feel his protective energy. She knew he would do whatever it took to keep her safe. Finally, the voices faded as they moved further down the street. Clara let out a sigh of relief. "Good boy, Shadow," she said again, giving him a gentle pat. Shadow wagged his tail, happy to hear her kind words. He knew his job was to keep her safe, and he took it very seriously. Little did Clara know, this was only the beginning of a day she would never forget. Shadow's past skills would soon come in handy in a way neither of them expected. Something was about to happen that would prove to everyone that Shadow was more than just a guide dog, he was a hero. As Clara walked toward the corner cafe, the air was suddenly filled with a loud rumble. It was the sound of motorcycles. The noise echoed off the buildings, making it hard to hear anything else. Clara could feel the vibrations through the sidewalk as the motorcycles roared to a stop. She gripped Shadow's harness a little tighter, trusting him to lead her safely. A group of bikers had parked their motorcycles in a messy row right in front of the cafe. Their voices were loud, and their laughter filled the street. They talked and joked with each other, not caring about the people around them. Some passers-by glanced at the bikers nervously, quickly looking away and walking faster. Others crossed the street to avoid getting too close. Clara, of course, couldn't see the way people were staring. She didn't notice the worried looks on their faces or how they hurried past. She just kept walking with Shadow, feeling the familiar path under her feet. But she could hear the bikers' rough voices, and she could sense the tension in the air. As she stepped closer to the cafe, one of the bikers suddenly shouted, "Hey, watch where you're going, lady." His voice was loud and sharp, cutting through the street noise. Clara stopped for a brief moment, feeling her heart race, but Shadow kept her moving. He gently guided her around a trash can that was blocking the sidewalk. The biker sneered, looking at Shadow with a grin. "What's this?" "A mutt leading the blind," he said, laughing. "Looks like a match made in heaven." The other bikers laughed loudly, some slapping their knees and shaking their heads. To them, it was funny making fun of a blind woman and her dog. Clara heard their laughter, but she didn't say a word. She simply held Shadow's harness tighter and kept moving forward. She had heard comments like this before. People often didn't understand what it was like to be blind. They didn't know how hard it could be or how important Shadow was to her. Shadow, on the other hand, didn't react. He didn't bark or growl. He just kept his head high and focused on his job. Clara knew he was trained to stay calm in situations like this. He was more than just a guide dog, he was her protector, her friend, and her eyes. What the bikers didn't know was that Shadow had once been something far more extraordinary. Before he became Clara's guide, Shadow had been a police dog. He had been trained to catch criminals, search for lost people, and even protect officers in dangerous situations. He wasn't just an ordinary dog, he was a hero in disguise. Clara took a deep breath and walked past the bikers without looking back. But they weren't done yet. "Where do you think you're going, lady?" another biker called out, stepping in her way. Clara could hear the sound of his heavy boots on the pavement. Shadow stopped, standing firmly in front of her. Clara felt her stomach tighten. She didn't like confrontations, but she trusted Shadow to handle whatever came their way. "I'm just walking," she said in a calm voice. "Please let me pass." The biker laughed again, but there was something mean in his voice. Walking, huh? With that little mutt leading you? How do you know he's not taking you in circles? The other bikers laughed even louder at his joke, but Clara didn't smile. She stayed quiet and waited. She had learned long ago that arguing with people like this wouldn't help. Instead, she trusted Shadow to guide her away. Shadow stood tall and still, his ears perked up. He didn't bark or growl, but Clara could feel the tension in his body. He was ready to move if she needed him to. Come on, let's leave her alone, one of the bikers finally said. She's just some blind lady, what's the fun in that? But the first biker wasn't ready to stop. He took another step closer, and Shadow let out a low, warning growl. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make the biker hesitate. Whoa, easy there, dog, the man said, holding up his hands. I was just kidding around. Clara took a deep breath and walked forward again. This time, the biker stepped aside, letting her pass. Shadow stayed close to her, his body still tense but controlled. Clara felt a small wave of relief wash over her. As she walked away, she could still hear the bikers talking behind her. That's one tough dog, one of them muttered. Yeah, another agreed, but it's just a guide dog. What's the worst he can do? If only they knew, Clara thought to herself. If only they knew that Shadow had once chased down dangerous criminals and helped put them behind bars. He wasn't just a guide, he was a guardian. Finally, the noise of the bikers faded as she reached the cafe entrance. She took a deep breath and patted Shadow gently. Good boy, she whispered. Shadow wagged his tail lightly, his job done. He was always ready to protect her, no matter what. Clara went inside the cafe, feeling the warmth of the place surround her. The smell of fresh coffee and baked bread filled the air, helping her feel calm again. She found her usual seat by the window and sat down, letting out a small sigh of relief. Shadow sat by her side, still alert but more relaxed now. He had done his job, just like he always did. As Clara sipped her coffee, she thought about the bikers outside. They didn't know her story, and they didn't know Shadow's past. To them, she was just a blind woman with a dog. But Clara knew the truth. She knew that Shadow was more than just her guide, he was her guardian angel. And today, like every other day, she was grateful to have him by her side. Clara walked calmly into the cafe, holding tightly to Shadow's harness. The little bell above the door jingled softly as she stepped inside. The smell of fresh coffee and warm pastries filled the air, and the quiet hum of people talking made the place feel cozy. Clara knew this cafe well, it was one of her favorite places to sit and enjoy a peaceful moment. But today, peace was not going to last. Behind her, the loud sound of heavy boots clomped against the floor. The bikers had followed her inside. Their voices were loud and rough as they shoved past other customers to grab a table in the corner. Chairs scraped against the floor as they sat down with a thud, still laughing and talking in harsh tones. Clara didn't say anything. She stayed quiet, pretending she didn't hear their rude comments. She moved carefully to her usual spot near the window, guiding herself with the help of Shadow. He led her to the chair, and she sat down slowly, keeping her hands on his harness for comfort. Shadow, however, was not as calm. His ears twitched, his body tensed, and he stood close to Clara, watching the bikers carefully. His dark eyes followed their every move. He could sense something wasn't right. Shadow wasn't just a regular dog, he had a job to do. And right now, his job was to protect Clara. The bikers kept whispering to each other, but their voices weren't as quiet as they thought. That dog's too well behaved to be just a guide, one of them muttered, leaning over the table. Yeah, another one chuckled. Bet it's worth something. Fancy dogs like that can be sold for a lot of money. Clara didn't hear them clearly, but Shadow did. He lowered his head slightly and let out a soft, quiet growl. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to show he didn't like what he was hearing. The bikers didn't know Shadow's past. They thought he was just a normal guide dog, leading a blind woman around town. But they were wrong. Shadow had once been something much more. Before Clara, he was a police canine, a dog trained to catch bad guys, find missing people, and protect those in danger. He had chased down criminals, sniffed out hidden dangers, and even saved lives. But none of that showed on the outside. To the bikers, he was just a quiet, well-trained dog. They thought he was an easy target. One of the men stood up, his boots clunking heavily on the wooden floor. He walked slowly toward Clara's table, pretending to look around the cafe, but his eyes were locked on Shadow. Shadow's body tensed even more, and his ears stood up. He didn't move, but he was ready. The man leaned against a nearby chair and spoke in a fake friendly voice. "Hey there, lady," he said, "that's a nice dog you've got." Clara looked up in the direction of his voice and smiled politely. "Thank you," she said softly. The man smirked. "He must be really smart, huh? Bet he cost a lot." Clara felt a little uncomfortable, but she didn't want to be rude. "Shadow is special," she said simply. "He helps me every day." The biker nodded, but there was something in his voice that made Shadow uneasy. "Yeah, I bet he does," the man said, glancing back at his friends. "You know, dogs like that, they don't come cheap." Clara didn't like where this conversation was going. She could feel Shadow standing closer to her, his body stiff. "He's not for sale," Clara said firmly. The man chuckled, but there was a hint of something mean in his laughter. "Ah, come on, lady," he said, "everything's got a price." Clara shook her head. "Shadow isn't just a dog. He's my friend." At that moment, Shadow let out a low, warning growl. It was soft but strong enough to make the biker step back. The man put his hands up, pretending to be innocent. "Whoa, easy there," he said, laughing nervously. "No harm done." Clara reached down and stroked Shadow's fur gently. "It's okay, Shadow," she whispered, but inside, she was starting to feel nervous. The biker walked back to his table, but Clara could still hear their whispers. "She's blind, man," one of them said. "She won't even know if we take the dog." Another one laughed. "Yeah, we just wait for the right moment. That dog's gonna make us rich." Clara couldn't hear everything, but she felt the tension in the air. Shadow could feel it too. He stayed close to her, his eyes never leaving the group. A waitress came to Clara's table, offering a kind smile. "What can I get for you today, Clara?" she asked. Clara tried to smile, pretending everything was normal. "Just a coffee, please," she said. As the waitress walked away, Clara reached down again and touched Shadow's head. "I think we should go soon, buddy," she whispered. Shadow wagged his tail lightly, but he didn't relax. He knew danger was close. The bikers were still watching. They were waiting. They thought Clara was weak because she couldn't see. They thought Shadow was just a gentle guide dog who wouldn't fight back. But they were wrong. Clara stayed calm, sipping her coffee slowly, trying to think. She didn't want trouble, but she knew that if the bikers tried anything, Shadow would be ready. She had heard stories about what Shadow used to do before he became her guide. He had taken down thieves, stopped bad people, and had been a hero in his past life. Today, he might have to be a hero again. One of the bikers stood up, stretching and cracking his knuckles. "Let's get out of here," he said. "We'll see the lady later." Clara sighed in relief as they walked toward the door, but Shadow still didn't move. He watched them closely, making sure they were really leaving. As the door swung shut behind them, Clara leaned down and hugged Shadow gently. "You're amazing," she whispered. Shadow wagged his tail again, happy to hear her voice, but his eyes stayed on the door. He knew this wasn't over. Clara finished her coffee and stood up, holding onto Shadow's harness once more. "Let's go home," she said. As they stepped outside, the streets were quiet again, but Shadow stayed alert. Clara may not have known everything going on around her, but she had Shadow. And that was all she needed. What the bikers didn't realize was that they were dealing with more than just a blind woman and her dog. They were dealing with a team. A strong, smart, and unstoppable team. And soon, they were going to find out the hard way. The moment happened so fast, it felt like a blur. Clara was sitting quietly at her table, sipping her coffee, while Shadow rested by her side. His ears were always alert, his body still but ready. The cafe was filled with the soft hum of conversation, the clinking of cups, and the smell of fresh pastries in the air. Everything seemed peaceful. But then, without warning, one of the bikers made his move. He stood up from his chair slowly, pretending to stretch, and walked toward Clara. His boots clomped heavily on the floor, and he glanced around, making sure no one was watching too closely. Then, with a quick and sneaky hand, he reached out to grab Shadow's leash. But before his fingers could touch it, Shadow moved. In the blink of an eye, Shadow twisted out of Clara's gentle grasp and sprang into action. A deep, sharp bark exploded from him, cutting through the cafe like an alarm. Tables shook, cups rattled, and everyone turned to look. "Whoa! What the?" the biker shouted, stumbling back in surprise. Before he could react, Shadow lunged forward, his powerful body knocking the man off his feet. The biker crashed onto the hard floor with a loud thud, his eyes wide with shock. Shadow stood over him, his teeth bared, his deep growl filling the air. His muscles were tense, ready to strike again if needed. The entire cafe fell silent. Every person in the room froze, their eyes locked on the scene unfolding in front of them. The other bikers, who had been so full of laughter and arrogance before, now sat frozen in their seats, their mouths open in shock. Their faces, once full of confidence, now showed fear. Clara stood up slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the table for balance. Her voice was calm but firm. "Shadow, enough," she said. Instantly, Shadow backed away but remained alert, standing protectively by Clara's side. His eyes stayed fixed on the biker on the floor, watching his every move. The man on the ground groaned, rubbing his arm where he had fallen. "What kind of dog is this?" he muttered, his voice shaky. The cafe door swung open with a loud creak. A police officer, drawn by the noise and commotion, stepped inside. His eyes widened the moment he saw Shadow standing tall and proud next to Clara. "No way," the officer said, his voice filled with disbelief. "That's Shadow? The retired K9 who helped take down the cartel leader last year." Clara tilted her head slightly, sensing the officer's presence. "You know Shadow?" she asked, surprised. The officer nodded, stepping closer. "Of course I do. Everyone in the force knows Shadow. He's a legend." He turned to the group of bikers, his eyes narrowing. "And you guys? You just tried to mess with the wrong dog." The bikers looked at each other nervously. They had thought they were picking on a helpless blind woman with a regular dog. But now, they realized they had made a huge mistake. This wasn't just a guide dog. This was a trained police dog, a hero. One of the bikers swallowed hard. "We didn't know. We thought. He's just a guide dog, right?" The officer shook his head, a small smile on his face. "Not just any dog. Shadow was one of the best. He helped take down some of the most dangerous criminals. Trained for years to catch bad guys, protect people, and stay alert in any situation. And guess what? He's still got it." The crowd inside the cafe murmured in amazement. Some people whispered to each other, while others nodded with respect. Clara stood there, feeling proud but also a little overwhelmed. She always knew Shadow was special, but hearing it out loud made her heart swell with gratitude. The biker on the floor slowly got up, holding his hands up. "Look, we didn't mean any trouble," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "We were just joking around." The officer crossed his arms, not buying his excuse. "Joking, huh? Well, let's see if you still find it funny when we take a little trip down to the station. Shadow stood his ground as the officer gestured for the bikers to follow him outside. They shuffled out of the cafe, their heads hanging low, their earlier bravado completely gone. As they left, Clara let out a soft sigh of relief. She knelt down and stroked Shadow's fur gently. "You're amazing," she whispered, her voice filled with love and gratitude. Shadow wagged his tail, his eyes soft and kind now that the danger was over. He licked Clara's hand gently, as if to say, "I've got you." The officer turned to Clara and smiled. "You're in good hands, ma'am. Shadow's still a hero." Clara smiled back, feeling safe and comforted. "I always knew he was." The cafe slowly returned to normal. People went back to their coffee and conversations, but now they looked at Clara and Shadow with admiration. Some even smiled at her, offering words of praise. "Your dog is incredible," said a woman sitting nearby. "You're lucky to have him." Clara nodded, holding Shadow close. "Yes," she said softly. "I am." As they left the cafe, the sun felt warmer, and the world seemed just a little kinder. Clara walked confidently, knowing that with Shadow by her side, she was never truly alone. And though the bikers might have thought they were dealing with an easy target, they learned an important lesson that day. Never underestimate a quiet hero. The police officer didn't waste any time. He took one step forward, his voice strong and firm. "You're all under arrest," he announced, pointing at the group of bikers. His eyes narrowed as he looked at each of them. "I recognize some of you. We've been looking for your gang for weeks now." The cafe fell silent. The other customers watched with wide eyes, their hands frozen mid-sip. No one dared to move. Clara sat quietly at her table, holding Shadow's harness, her heart still pounding from the excitement. She didn't say anything she didn't need to. Shadow had already done enough. His brave actions spoke louder than any words ever could. One of the bikers tried to argue. "We didn't do anything," he said, raising his hands. "We were just joking around." The officer shook his head, unimpressed. "Save it," he said. "You think I don't know who you are? We've had reports about a group of bikers causing trouble all over town. Robberies, stolen goods, even some fights." He pointed to another officer standing by the door. "Take their pictures and call it in. We'll take them down to the station for questioning." Shadow stood proudly beside Clara, his tail wagging slightly but his eyes still watching the bikers closely. He knew the danger wasn't fully over until they were gone. Clara reached down and stroked his fur gently. "Good boy," she whispered. The officers began handcuffing the bikers one by one. Some of them tried to protest, but they had no choice. One of them, the man who had tried to grab Shadow's leash earlier, shook his head in disbelief. "How were we supposed to know?" he muttered under his breath. "It's just a dog." The officer nearby heard him and let out a small chuckle. "Just a dog," he repeated with a smirk. "That mutt has saved more lives than you can imagine." He looked down at Shadow with admiration. "You're lucky he didn't do more." Clara felt a small smile tug at her lips. She already knew how special Shadow was, but hearing others say it made her feel even prouder. As the officers led the bikers outside, the people in the cafe finally relaxed. A soft murmur spread through the crowd. Some people whispered to each other, amazed at what they had just seen. "That dog is incredible," one woman said, shaking her head in awe. "I thought he was just a guide dog," another man added. "I had no idea he could do that." Clara smiled politely at their words, but inside, she felt relieved that everything was finally over. Shadow nudged her hand gently, sensing her emotions. The cafe manager, a kind old man with grey hair, walked over to Clara. "Are you okay, dear?" he asked kindly. Clara nodded. "Yes, thanks to Shadow," she said softly, reaching down to pat her loyal companion. The manager smiled. "He's a real hero," he said. "You're lucky to have him." Clara chuckled softly. I know, she replied. He's my best friend. The officer who had recognized Shadow walked over and crouched down beside him. You know, Shadow used to work with us, he said, looking at Clara. He was one of our best canine officers. Smart, brave, and always ready to help. I guess some things never change. Clara smiled, feeling a deep warmth in her heart. I didn't know much about his past, she admitted. But I always knew he was special. The officer nodded. He is. And he's in the right hands now. Shadow